All right, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per normal, we sort of do this in three parts. We'll do the first one, which is the news of the week, what's been happening in the solar industry over the last week or so. And then we'll do announcements about upcoming webinars, some conferences, things of that nature. Open it up for some questions and answers, of course, all the way through the year. I like to be interrupted periodically, so that's all good. And then we'll focus on a specific topic. This particular week, I'm going to be focusing on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a little over a year old now, and I just wanted to do kind of an update to see where we're at. All right, so into the news of solar this week. There was a recent conference in Newport, Rhode Island. It's called the Grid Tech Connect Forum. And at this conference, the regulators, the developers, and the utilities got together, and they were talking. There were a number of sessions about all of the delays that are involved in interconnection to the grid for these large-scale projects. So this was the main topic of discussion. To put some of this into perspective, back in 2005, it took about 2 years for a developer to find the land, create the solar array, connect it to the grid. By 2022, that length of time had increased to about 4 years, largely because of the delays that were imposed by the interconnection process. And then this year now, a lot of the regional authorities are saying it's going to be at least 5 years before they'll review any interconnection applications. So that's adding a significant amount of time to the process. Now, the regulators are saying that a lot of the reason for this is because of the lack of long distance and high capacity transmission lines. So to give you a sense of the scale here, the Department of Energy just announced this big to flourish. They're investing $1.3 billion in 3 transmission lines that are going to go across 6 states. This is going to add about 3.5 gigawatts of transmission capacity, but the current backlog is already 2,000 gigawatts of backlog from just renewables alone. So the Department of Energy has announced this roadway or pathway to try and deal with the backlog. And it's really in 4 parts. One is they're trying to be more transparent in some of the issues involved in the application. Then they're also trying to streamline the processes. That all sounds like happy talk. And then they're also wanting to prioritize those projects that are more economical, which would give a priority to renewable energy, as opposed to first in, first out. Because a lot of what's happening is a developer may say, I'm thinking about developing this project. Well, get your application in real early, even if it's a highly speculative project, because it's going to be 5 years before they look at it. So they're throwing a lot of applications in, only a few of which are going to go through. So it's backlogging the system that way as well. And then, of course, they want to keep the grid resilient. All right, well, a new study by E2 has found that as many as 400,000 jobs may be added to the economy here in North America as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. About 300,000 of these are going to be as part of the construction over the next 5 years of these systems. And this is for systems that have already been approved. They're already in the process. Then about 100,000 jobs that are going to be ongoing, that are part of these generation systems. Now, there's also a lot of investment that's as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. The majority of it is in batteries and electric vehicles. And it's kind of interesting because much of this investment is taking place in what they're referring to as the the battery belt, which is the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Pete, I see you've got a question there.
Yes. So going back to these arrays that, would you clarify for us, are these installed and ready to run, but waiting for interconnect agreements, but otherwise they could be producing electricity?
The ones that are creating the jobs, or the ones that are in the process?
Um, the question would be, are there arrays that could be ready to run but sit idle for months at a time because they're not able to connect to the grid?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. Yes, there are. And then, of course, there are jobs or builds that they're just simply holding off on certain phases of development until they get that green light. So, if until they get some sort of authorization, I think this is it's I suspect if I were a developer, I wouldn't want to go too far in the process until I've gotten authorization to connect. But I know with smaller systems, you get the approval from the utility in this case, and I assume there's a stage there with interconnection. And then there's the permission to operate, the PTO that you get after the thing is already constructed. And that kind of raises a separate issue, because I did hear a webinar where some of these utility scale developers were saying that the way it's working at the moment is the permission to operate is also creating months-long delays, because the utility will come out, because this comes from the utility, and they'll say, I want to see this thing generating at 90% of its nameplate capacity. And they come out on a day that is raining. And you go, well, it's not going to produce 90% of its nameplate because it's cloudy, it's rainy, or whatever. And they'll go, okay, well, apply again for me to come out. That'll be another 3 months before I'll pop back out here. And another issue there was that in the past, they said that they were sort of given authorization to turn on the system when it was completed and sort of test it just to see, are your inverters working? Is this working? Is there a problem? Is there a part that's not functioning? Whatever. Well, now they're not being allowed to do that at all. So they turn on the system when the inspector is there and one of the inverters isn't operating, or there's a software glitch or whatever. And he just throws his hands up and goes, well, call me when you got it working. And you're like, oh, how do I know when I got it working? Because I'm not allowed to turn it on unless you're standing here. And they go, well, I'll come back in 3 months. So all of these things are adding to the delays.
So where I'm going with this is, for our crew here, is there not a business case to be made for bringing out a portable load like a Haber-Bosch ammonia plant on wheels and plugging it in and getting some use out of the solar array while waiting for the connection authorization? I mean, I would split the difference with the grid or with the PV array operator and pay him half of whatever he would get. He'd get some money. I get electricity for half the price, and 3-6 months later, whatever, I roll the plant over to another array. But in the meantime, I bring out a tanker truck of water and haul away tanker trucks of ammonia for pretty low cost.
I think that's a good idea. I mean, I'm sure there's logistical issues and how it's connecting and where it's connecting. But what the key in my mind is this market of utility scale behind the meter projects, where there are companies coming and emerging where they're saying, you know what, I'm not going to mess with the whole interconnection thing because that's connecting out to the grid. I'm going to find a large industrial or commercial project and hook the system in essentially behind the meter. So that customer is buying 100% of the production from this utility scale project. So it might be a university, it might be an industrial plant. And that avoids a lot of those interconnection delays because it's the same as doing a rooftop system. You're not hooking into the grid at large, and you're not having to deal with a lot of the transformer issues and substation issues and things of that nature. So I suspect we'll see a lot more of that happening. And what you're saying is basically, let's have a portable behind the meter connection point that we can go out, and it could be used for ammonia, as you say, or hydrogen production, or something like that. Because if the thing is ready, it's basically being curtailed at this point. So that's just an opportunity cost that's sitting there, and maybe sitting there for years.
It could be. It's some income's better than no income.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, back on the Inflation Reduction Act, It's interesting that all of this activity that's happening, a recent poll just said that a survey of Americans, about 71% of Americans say they've either never heard of it or have very little information about it. It's such a transformative piece of legislation that nobody seems to have heard about. All right, an independent think tank called Ember has found that about 50% of the world's economies are operating in at least 5 years beyond the peak fossil fuel usage period. So this represents about 170 economies. In these economies, there has been about a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions during the last decade. 78 of these economies have actually replaced fossil fuels as the majority generating fuel for power, replace that with renewables. And they go on. Oh, and most of this activity has taken place in Europe, in North America, and in Oceania, which is Australia, New Zealand, the islands down around in there. The only regions of the world that have not exceeded or gone beyond peak fossil fuel usage are the Middle East and Asia. So those are the two left. But even Africa, South America, they're beyond, just not 5 years beyond. The study further says that 2023 may actually be the first year in recorded history that we're going to see a global reduction in CO2 emissions, largely due to this reduction in power generation by fossil fuels. And there's been a lot of talk in the media lately about artificial intelligence, all of the benefits it can bring to society, as well as a lot of the existentialist risks that are associated with it. But the one thing that we know for sure about it is it's going to use a lot of electricity. In fact, this transition to the digital economy is using a lot of electricity and putting a lot of strain on systems that are already strained. So, for example, Bitcoin, which is the leading cryptocurrency, in the generation of Bitcoin uses as much power as the nation of Norway uses each year just to generate Bitcoin. About 2 to 3% of all of the global electricity is consumed by data centers. 5G networks use 3 times as much power as 4G networks. The electric use in telecom is expected to grow by about 150 to 170% by 2026. And in artificial intelligence, the most visible of these is ChatGPT. Well, ChatGPT 3 required to train the system about as much power as required to run a suburban home for about 120 years. Forward a couple of years into ChatGPT 4, it required 275 times as much electricity to train that program. And as these systems are getting larger and more complex, that just continues to grow. In fact, a recent study shows that AI servers are going to require between 85 and 134 terawatt hours of electricity each year by the year 2027, which is about the same amount of energy as it takes, or electricity as it takes, to run Argentina or Sweden. So all of these technologies are going to put a huge strain on electrical demand. And that's the news for this week. Anybody have any comments on anything they've heard or things they want to add to that discussion before I jump on to the events? Give you just a second.
Some states have like Kansas does have a prohibition against third-party generation. So it's going to be really difficult for people to make revenue because you've got to be a licensed utility in the state to be able to sell power to another entity.
Really? Well, yeah. Well, but of course, I guess you could probably get around some of that if it's a behind the meter thing by simply having the company using it. You're allowed to generate your own power, right? So I don't know how they do that, but that seems weird. I guess, well, it's obviously the utilities have jumped in and lobbied and gotten that passed, huh? So.
Oh, yeah.
The utilities, don't you just love to hate them? So, all right. Let's see. I can give you an update. Yeah, go ahead, Eric. Give an update about Pennsylvania's 13 cooperatives. jump on in.
All right, so I met with our local Unilec cooperative and sat down with them during their directors meeting. Basically what they are doing is they are not allowing me to net meter or aggregate my meters anymore. So the only electricity I can use basically is what I'm producing from that array to that meter. And the second thing they're doing is monthly true-ups. They're not allowing me to bank my kilowatt hours. They're paying me out the avoided cost at the end of every month. So in essence, if they do vote for Pennsylvania to have community solar, this guts it before it ever starts. I mentioned that to them and they said, what's community solar? So fun. Long story short, I told them I don't want to make trouble for them, but I'm not done with this, and see how far I can go with this. The governor's office obviously is trying to push green energy, and this is basically shutting it down. So there's got to be a give somewhere, but the only saving grace is we have a 5-year grace period. So I get 5 more years to pay off my system before they go with just the avoided cost. And I asked if that extended to like DCNR's large solar arrays that they're putting in to basically net meter a park. And the answer is, if they're not using electricity at a meter, if they're putting in an array and putting in a meter there, they are just getting the avoided cost, period, the end. They're selling electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour or whatever it is, and having that taken off the electric bills, which is basically a fourth to a fifth what it's worth. So that's the update.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bill, you had a comment on that?
Eric, we're having a similar situation with our rural electrics here. The one here local is charging $1,000 application fee. Another one down the road is charging a $700 application fee and then $500 a year annual charge to have solar connected. So we're in this interesting, and they're no longer doing net metering. And what they got into the power purchase agreement with a co-op in Arkansas, which is building arrays, but it's like the old coal plants where they had to assure that the financiers that they would have somebody who would buy that power. And so they've gone into these long-term power purchase agreements that keep them from generating more than, in Kansas, it's more than 5% of their own self-generation. So, and then they have another, I truly believe that they have another power purchase agreement with this co-op in Arkansas that says beyond that, you will be further restricted, because we want to sell our peak power from the community solar ones or the co-op owned solar ones. So what we're doing at this point, and it's really a cat and mouse game, because we have on, I don't know what inverters you have, we use Enphase. And so we're advising when you first set up the system, you can select a grid profile and you can set it to no export. And no export, you can get all the money you can get from it and you can build as big a system as you want. You just can't export any of it to them, even for that 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's going to be a cat and mouse game. I know that in Texas, I think that Jay was talking some months ago about the fact that in Texas, they are doing flyovers to find PV arrays that are generating on the grid that perhaps aren't registered. So this is going to be a real interesting period and it's an interesting question of ownership because the privately owned arrays on people's homes should not be involved in that power purchase agreement. So, that they're not participating in that contract. They may be members of the co-op, but it's not a co-op owned array. So there's going to be some interesting legal issues here.
Yeah. It's not just Unilec that's doing that. This is 14 co-ops across the state of Pennsylvania, including New Jersey, that are going forward with this.
There are a dozen here. There are a dozen of the co-ops here, distribution co-ops who are doing the same thing.
Well, I know, Jay, you had talked about some of the newer systems that if you're overproducing, it can load dump to another place. So if you have a battery backup, instead of pushing it to the grid, you can push it onto a battery or charge your vehicle when you're overproducing. I think someone needs to come up with one that will be compatible with all the systems out there, because it will certainly be needed.
Yeah, it sounds like, well, a couple of things there. The co-ops are typically, because they're nonprofits, they're exempted from statewide net metering rules. So something that may apply to an investor-owned utility may not apply to the co-ops. And in the past, it's just not been an issue for them, because they're usually farmers, like you say, what's community solar? What's solar? They're kind of in the dark. It is a user or customer-owned system. So I guess you could put pressure on them at the annual meetings where they serve you hot dogs in some high school gymnasium and get enough folks. But in my community here anyway, if I raised a big stink about solar, everybody would, call me they'd want to own the libs or whatever. And I would be in a minority. So that might not be a good approach there. It seems like they're just pushing us towards battery, and becoming independent of them, except as a backup source of power. That's kind of what these utilities are forcing. Our utility, our co-op is still pretty supportive, only because they don't care, but they did raise the monthly access fee for me to $44 a month, whether I use a kilowatt hour or not. But if I didn't have solar, it'd only be $20 a month. So that's kind of the punitive reaction to solar. Their argument there is that because I have solar, I'm not using as much power as had I been without solar, and they make their money off the sale of power. And I said, well, then you probably should factor that into your pricing model, not charge me what it costs to connect to the grid, charge everybody that, and then charge everybody the cost of electricity, but don't subsidize one with the other, which is what you're telling me you're doing. And, but these are not, these guys did not go to the Wharton School of Business. These are mostly, farmers who somehow got in on the board of the local co-op because, they're a 7th generation farmer who happens to know everybody, that's kind of where that's at. So let's see, before we put that one to bed, anybody else have a comment on that? Thanks, Eric, for updating us on that. That's sad state of affairs, but unfortunately it's part of the, I've quoted Gandhi a number of times here where he said, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they attack you, and then you win. Well, we're in attack mode, and that's kind of where we're going at the moment. All right, let me jump into some of the upcoming events. Today, November 7th at 2 p.m., there's a webinar from Wood Mackenzie on tracking costs, labor shortages, and logistics. Then tomorrow, Trina Solar, 2 p.m. on their tracking system. Once again, I'll just remind you, I'm not giving you any links on this. Just go ahead and search for them. You'll find them if you just do a Google search. We're in that economy, where the digital economy. As I mentioned earlier, the Ohio Energy Conference coming up tomorrow and Thursday in Columbus, Ohio. I just mentioned it because I'm going. November 9th, 2 p.m., expanding into commercial and industrial sales. So if you're doing residential, you want to get into the bigger systems, here's a webinar for you. Then on the 9th, again at 2 p.m. Same one. What am I doing? Workers' comp. Sorry, I didn't change my description up there. So the other one is about workers' comp and solar. Then the one about expanding into commercial. Then there's utility scale design coming up on the 14th, 2 p.m. And on the 15th at 9 a.m., there's one on utility scale DERMS in New Mexico. A DERM is a distributed energy management system, distributed energy resource management system. All right, LEED talk. There's a LEED tech talk. LEEDs is an architectural thing around renewables and energy reduction, use reduction on November 15th at 2 p.m. Then there is, did I do it again? I think I did. Yes, I did. I didn't change my description again. This one, same time, is on the end phase battery, the new battery that's out. And then there's the lead tech talk. And then on the 16th, there's one about the API, the Google API. We did a session on that last week. A deeper dive on what that is, Google getting into some of the data associated with Google Maps and integrating that into a lot of products so that you can use that information for solar design. And then there's a workforce development, charting the path of the renewable energy transition on November 24th. Lots of webinars. Another one on mastering UL 3741. This has to do with rapid shutdown. And they're talking about that in commercial systems. And then my shameless advertisement, if you're interested in some online programs or some in-person training, we have it at solarpvtraining.com. And then I'll open it up. Anybody else have any other events or items they want to bring up before I jump into our topic du jour here? If you just, yep. Go ahead, Devin.
It's not on your topic. That's a request I ask. And I don't know if any members might be able to recommend. I'm looking for somebody who could supply AC combiners.
So you're talking about, sorry, AC combiners?
Yes. So combining multiple PV strings together, inverter strings, outputs.
Okay, you're just wanting to know what if people have had experience with that, or if there are
No.
products out
I'm
there?
actually looking for a supplier.
Oh, a supplier for the large.
Yeah.
You're doing large scale commercial and almost utility scale systems. So you're just saying you want some sort of combiner box, basically, but at a large scale for that. Yep. So yeah, I'm not sure of a specific supplier for that. I know smaller systems you can get them, but we'll put that out. And if anybody has a word on a good supplier for large scale combiners, get in touch with Devin. And if you need to get in touch with them, I can connect you up through ours. And I saw Wendy was asking about links to all of these webinars. And I don't really put them in because they're so tortured. But if you need a specific one, I can provide it to you if you drop me an email or just do a Google search on the webinars and you should be able to find them pretty readily. All right, so let me talk.
Jay, if I could.
Oh yeah. Hey, Megan.
Hey, sorry about that. My name is Megan Webb. I serve as Dean of Advancement and Innovation here at Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College. We're located in Moorfield, West Virginia. I'm very happy to share that we have the pleasure of collaborating with Mr. Wormke on PV1 solar applicator certifications, and we'll be beginning our next training program, which is hybrid online. That series begins January 16th, and then we'll offer 2-day in-person training here on Eastern's campus, February 28th and 29th. This is at a very affordable rate. We have a state grant that's helping us. So we're asking $200 for those that are 16 to 18 years of age. And then those 18 and above or adults, those would be $400. So I've dropped the link in the chat there to learn more about the training program and how to enroll by emailing workforceed@easternwv.edu. And I'll drop my information in the chat as well. But we are having a seminar session on December 4th in regard to this training program if you're interested. So thank you so much, Jay, for the time. And thank you for allowing me to visit.
Okay, well, thanks, Megan. I should have brought that up. And if you need a link, you can look at Eastern West Virginia Community and Technical College. I think that's the proper name, or our website, solarpvtraining.com has a link that gets you to them. So it's nice to have that training subsidized, and it does lead towards the ETA International certification in solar. So if you're looking to get certified in a certification that's recognized internationally, you can tap into that training and get it done in a very beautiful location in the hills of West Virginia. So, all right. So let me, if there are no other announcements here, I'll jump into the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've talked about this during these sessions before, the Inflation Reduction Act. And it really is hard to overstate how transformative this particular legislation is when it comes to renewable energy. I mean, in some of the other aspects of the act, I don't know that it's filling the promises or fulfilling the promises it made, but certainly within renewable energy it is. And it's a little over 1 year old now. And I just wanted to go ahead and give you an update, see where we're standing on some of these things. So now it was last August that the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law. He's handing a pen there to Joe Manchin, who the senator from West Virginia, who was, I don't want to say instrumental. It's just that he was the last holdout. And without his vote, it would not have become law, but it did because he did support it. And in large part, there are a lot of provisions in there that really do help the workforce development within Appalachia, specifically within coal country. So I think he did a good thing, and many of the things he held out for, I tend to agree with in retrospect. But he was kind of demonized through that process, and is demonized today for signing it throughout a lot of West Virginia. So then we see that what is it exactly that this act promised anyway? And it was talking, and as the name implies, it was marketed as an Inflation Reduction Act. It was going to reduce the deficit. It was going to lower energy costs by, to get to clean energy 40% by 2030. That's some of the marketing they gave. Allows Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices, lower healthcare premiums. It was going to make the big corporations and ultra wealthy pay a minimum tax. And then there was going to be additionally $500 billion in tax credits and spending to boost clean energy. So that's kind of how it was marketed there. Now, a year later, we're finding that Big Pharma is has sued about all of these cost reductions for medical prescriptions and the like. So that's sort of held up in court. So those savings are not being realized yet. Congress jumped in and kind of gutted a lot of the minimum tax provisions and the enforcement provisions. So those are not really being seen. I guess the end result here is a lot of the promised savings or revenues are not materializing, but certainly the spending is. That kind of feels like government as per normal. Now, inflation, which was the primary motivation of this, as it was marketed at the time, was at about 9%. It's now down to about 3.2%. Although most analysts, when they look at that, they say this act really had nothing to do with that. This was just part of the bigger economy. Take that for what it's worth. Economies, it's all projections, but my guess is it didn't really have a lot to do with it. But to my way of thinking, all of these other things were kind of a way to sell the package. It really was a climate bill with significant costs attached to it, but we're motivated to try and deal with climate change and to deal with fossil fuels, the transition from fossil fuel to the renewable energy economy. And clearly that's something I support. And so I'm biased in all of this. So my perspective may not be how you would interpret it, but this is where we're landing. So what was in it for renewables? A lot of this was all around the ITCs, the investment tax credits, and the production tax credits. So if you're a manufacturer, you're going to get paid or subsidized a certain amount per unit for making this stuff. Or if you're an investor, you're going to get some tax benefits. So I think this is part of a larger plan that the Biden administration has to try and transition us away from a fossil fuel economy to a more renewable energy economy, and one that is more focused on domestic production as opposed to this global economy just in time, import everything from somewhere and we just hope nothing goes wrong. So that's kind of this transition. The analogy I always use is like during the Eisenhower administration, when they looked at recreating the transportation system of the US in ways that have been impactful for decades with the interstate highway system and the like. Well, this is similar in scope, but rather than the government coming in and building all of these things and spending money that way, they're incentivizing private companies and individuals to rebuild this generation and transmission system by giving them tax credits. And I think it's working. I think it's working in very large measure. And we have some statistics already in the first year that are showing that. They also have incentives for low income and energy communities. Energy communities are basically communities that have in large part relied on fossil fuels for a significant portion of their economy. I always call this the Joe Manchin provision. Basically, all of West Virginia qualifies in this. And then they allowed you to take these tax credits and sell them to people who are unrelated to you. So it creates a whole market there of saying, okay, I may not be making a lot of money where these tax credits don't mean anything to me, but I can sell them to other people and see that as real money. So that's a big deal in that particular marketplace. And another big deal in that was nonprofits can now also receive or monetize these tax credits. In the past, if you didn't pay tax, if you were exempt from paying tax, for example, as we just pointed out, Eastern West Virginia Community College, they're a nonprofit organization. Well, if they want to put a big solar array on their facility, in the past, they wouldn't have had any tax benefits because they don't pay taxes. So they would have worked a deal with a taxable investor who would have perhaps built this array on their property and then sold them the power in a power purchase agreement, and it would have been that kind of thing. But that investor would have made the money on the project. Now they can go ahead and install it and then receive back that tax credit in the form of like a rebate from the federal government. So that's a big deal there. Another big deal was that for these larger systems, there is a prevailing wage requirement, and that prevailing wage is for systems that are greater than 1 megawatt in size. And essentially that means paying union wages for installation, which again, we didn't want to turn this industry into a Walmart where everybody's working for minimum wage. You want to see these as jobs that are being developed, and these are jobs that are going to support a family. And as part of that, then to qualify, 15% of your workforce has to be involved in structured apprenticeship programs. And these apprenticeship programs can either be union delivered or college delivered, or nonprofits are getting into that. And that's where that's leading. And I guess the idea there is you're developing a workforce that is indeed a profession. Then there's the promotion of electric vehicles. There are a lot of incentives that are built into that. And it really is probably one of the great signature climate change bills in history, you know, and so we'll acknowledge that, and some will applaud it and others will not. But listening to government hype on this, it's going to be highly partisan. But the analysis from Wood Mackenzie that just came out, I thought was a little bit better, a little more unbiased assessment of where we are 1 year later. And what they're showing is that with utility scale solar, there have been about $100 billion of ITCs, that's investment tax credits, each year that are going to be ramping up on this. And some people will look at that and say that's government spending. You know, these are tax deductions or tax credits. You could argue that, but it's also perhaps from investment that otherwise would not have been made. So if I'm able to deduct that, then I'm pumping money into the economy. So, it's again going to depend on your perspective there. But what's resulted is a rush for all of the prime sites. So these investors are running out there. As we mentioned earlier, there's a long delay for interconnection. There's a long ramp up process, but they're wanting to lock in all the good sites. So a lot of this is happening. There's a bit of a gold rush at the moment there. Transmission and interconnection remain the big issues there, and that's expected to continue for a fair long time. And what's kind of interesting is the market now is beginning to price into their long-term projections that these investment tax credits are going to be around for a decade or so, maybe even longer. And what that's going to mean is there's going to continue to be an expansion of these utility scale systems at a pretty dramatic rate. So when they're building out their financing or their returns, they're saying, okay, we used to plan that at a certain period of time after the initial contract is over, we'll be able to recontract at a fairly high rate. But now, because there's going to be all this new stuff built, we may not be able to do that. So actually, in the short term, it's pushing up the price of power purchase agreements because they're saying the initial one, I better make my money because I'm probably not going to make as much money in the future. So it's a little counterintuitive there, where because all of these new things are coming online, the prices are actually going up because we've got to make the money now because it's going to be cheaper in the future. Who knows if that's going to be the case, but that's their thinking at the moment. Then with the solar industry, there's still a lot of unanswered questions because this legislation is nothing if not complicated. And there's been a lot of IRS reports on what it means, how it's going to be implemented, starting to shake through, but we're still in the first year or so of this process. And we just don't know yet. People haven't filed their taxes for 2023 yet. So the labor requirements, as I mentioned, 15% of the workforce on these larger systems, if you've got 4 employees or more, building a system that's greater than 1 megawatt, all of these things are requiring, and the penalty if you fail that test is pretty significant, because you go from what might be 40% tax credit down to a 6% tax credit if you fail. So, it could be millions of dollars. So how do you comply with that? And how do you make sure you're complying with that provision, that it is a Department of Energy or a Department of Labor recognized apprenticeship program that meets the rules that nobody's quite sure about yet? The domestic content issue is a big deal. They're saying you get a 10% bump on your tax credits if you're using a certain portion of domestic content. But what does that really mean? All the materials that went into making it, is that the domestic content? Is it just assembled in the US? How much, where, when, why, how, and all of that's being worked out. There are a lot of adders through here. How do I apply for those? There's things like if you're in a Native American jurisdiction, you get additional. If you're low income housing, you get additional. So there's confusion around that. And then, of course, the tax equity markets. This is a term they throw around a lot. Tax equity, it's basically, you don't need the tax benefits. I do. I want to buy these from you. Are there financiers that are out there who are willing to buy them? I did see that typically right now, solar tax equity goes between 90 cents to 92 cents on the dollar. So if I wanted to sell my tax to somebody else, they're going to pay me for $1 of tax deduction or tax credit. Sorry, they're going to pay me 90 cents. So they make their money on that dime. Nonprofits can now get that money directly back from the government. So why would they sell off their tax equity? It's coming back 100% in a rebate. So that disrupts the marketplace. So there's a lot of concern. Is there too much, not enough projects for the investors that are existing? And that just throws it all into uncertainty. Now, as far as domestic manufacturing, we've touched on this quite a lot in this discussion here about all the new plants that are opening up across the country. 51 new large facilities, either new or expanded, have been announced since the IRA took place. About $100 billion in private investment for this. So already that's generating a certain amount of economic activity. They're claiming about 155 gigawatts of solar supply chain is now being added to our domestic supply chain, which is quite significant. In fact, CES says that will meet 90% of our US demand by 2026. Maybe, I hope. We'll find out. I think McKinsey has a different view on that. They're not quite as rosy. They're saying that the domestic production is going to lag the demand for a number of years in the future, that a lot of these projects that have been announced aren't necessarily going to be completed in time or completed at all, perhaps. That the higher domestic cost of production will not outweigh the tax credit for buying domestic. So if you're getting a 10% bump or tax credit for buying domestic, and it costs 20% more to buy a domestic product versus an imported, then why would you do it? So, now bear in mind the amount of money in a project that's for equipment is only a third to a half of the overall project cost. So that will come into play, but we'll just have to wait and see. Can they produce these products domestically competitively? So that's an issue there. There are going to be project delays, interconnection we mentioned. There's also the not in my backyard kind of thing. Talked about no solar on prime farmland movements and things of that nature. So if I'm a manufacturer and I've geared up to supply what looks like it's going to be projects in the pipeline, and then these projects in the pipeline get delayed and delayed and delayed, we may see some of these newly opened manufacturing facilities closing down because their sales are not meeting what they projected. So that's going to throw a bit of problems into there. And then there are some critical items within the supply chain that are going to cause further delays. For example, as they give the generator step-up units, oftentimes there's a 2, 3, 4, 5 year delay in purchasing these step-up generators so if you get one critical component that you can't get for 2 or 3 years, that's going to cause the entire project to suffer and be delayed even more. Just glad I'm not in those large-scale developments. All right, so then we talk about utility scale storage. This is where a lot of the investment is taking place. And of course, North America is on track to be the second largest producer of manufacturer of storage outside of China. And one thing that the IRA did is it decoupled the tax incentives from solar for storage. Used to be you could get the tax credits for storage if it was associated with a solar development. Now you can get them whether they are or they're not. Storage is just considered a separate generating technology, and it qualifies. But once again, interconnection, that's the big bugaboo in all of this at large scale. And electric vehicles themselves are getting a subsidy. There's a tax credit for, and I'm going by memory here, but it seems to me it's around $7,000 if you buy a new one, and like $3,500 if you buy a used one, but they have to be made in America. And what does that mean? And what the batteries and which ones qualify and which ones don't, and all of that. But regardless of that, these tax incentives are having an impact. And we're moving in this direction regardless, but this is just accelerating it. They're saying that it's increased 35% just in the first quarter. It's telling, if you look at the EV sales as a percentage of overall auto sales in the US, it's right now at 9 to 10% of all of the vehicles sold in America are electric vehicles. Last year, 6%, the year before that, 3%, the year before that, 1%. So we're seeing a pretty dramatic ramp up. And all of the projections that are out there at the moment, they're all over the place, but basically they're in this range by 2030 of between 62 to 86% of all of the vehicles sold in America by 2030, which is only 6-7 years away, are going to be electric. And in China, they're anticipating it'll be over 90%. So China is adopting electric vehicles quite rapidly. And one thing that's interesting and a driver behind a lot of this is fleet vehicles. They currently represent about 10% of the growth of EV, but there are a number of programs coming up in different states that are incentivizing zero emission vehicles. And they're really looking at last mile delivery. That's kind of like the UPS, FedEx, DoorDash, those kind of things. Road hailing like Uber, Lyft, those kind of moving towards car rental. It's going to be very, very quickly. You go to a car rental agency and you're probably a lot of people's first experience driving electric vehicle is going to be through rentals. And then municipal vehicles, post office, they're moving towards electric. And then drayage, and I had never heard this term before, but basically drayage, they're talking about semi-trucks, vehicles that haul stuff. That's a big issue because, of course, charging station infrastructure is going to be an impediment to how this adoption continues. And it's going to happen pretty rapidly, but chicken and egg kind of thing. And we're already seeing like in Findlay, Ohio, where they're looking at large vehicle charging stations that don't deal with the whole behind the grid, the demand charges from utilities and the like. And that might be an example of something that can happen with these large utility scale solar arrays. If they're waiting for interconnection, they could build up a charging station, operation there in the meantime. So how is this what's the financial impact so far? Well, the IRA allocates about $370 billion in tax credits over 10 years. The data shows that it's already spurred about $270 billion in private investment in clean energy. That, to me, seems like a pretty good return. And about 400,000 jobs is what's projected based on the news I reported today, and $156 billion in construction over the next 5 years. A lot of this stuff is maybe pie in the sky, but I think that the impact is certainly significant, and we're seeing a good return on that initial investment that is really just in the first stages. So that's my report on the IRA as it's turning into a toddler. Does anybody have anything they want to add before we call this session done? Give you just a second. Hearing none. Okay, well, we'll see you guys. Go ahead.
I think there's an interesting slowdown in terms of transmission interconnections, but also in transmission construction. One of the problems they've had is the access of right-of-ways for new transmission lines, the Grain Belt Express and other big transmission lines going across the country. On the other hand, at the residential level, you have some critical components. You mentioned generator step-up units and the lag time on those, but we're finding a real shortage in just meter cans. We're buying one, we're allowed to buy one at a time instead of buying, 10 at a time or 20 at a time. So meter cans just themselves are becoming a scarce commodity and are being doled out in small lumps. And that's going to play into what we were talking about earlier in terms of being able to supply the demand when the Solar for All provisions come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're going to see, we're doing a transformation of our society, and we're going to run into a lot of hiccups here. And as you mentioned, some very simple things you run out. I remember in a lot of places you can't find anything but black wire, well, the inspectors always used to say it's got to be 6 gauge or larger before you can use the tape. But now, since you can't buy red wire, just put red tape on it, even if it's small. So, these little kind of things that we're going to have to work our way through. But interesting time to be alive. So anyway, I'm going to call it off right there, and we'll see you guys next week. All right, take care.